Is the Bible scientifically accurate? I'm joined today by Dr. Jim Painter, who is a Christian and a food scientist, to help unpack that question. Jim, as somebody who's an expert in human nutrition, I'm just curious, is there any kind of scientific basis for the food laws that we see in Leviticus 11?
When I first became a Christian in my second year of college, and I was looking in the Bible, and then I found these food laws, and I thought, that's amazing, I wonder what they are. And so I started kind of looking into them to see if there's any basis for them in nutrition that I'm studying. And so the first ones I looked at were the sea animals. And as I looked at these sea animals, the ones that have fins and scales, okay, how's that different than the ones that don't have fins and scales, that just have a skin on them? And as we started looking at those, really, the ones without skin, without fins and scales, are carnivores. That's the sharks, out there, the large fish that are eating other fish. And then you have these little fish they don't grow very big, they're fairly small, and they could be primary consumers of little other fish, but they generally just eat, plant foods. And so when we looked at those, I love salmon. I hate sardines, but they're good for you. But it's got a head and eyes, and they're looking at you, and it's hard to eat it. But it's good, because it's a little dinky fish. And so I started looking in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2010, Appendix 11, and it has a list of omega-3 fatty acid content, and it has a list of mercury content. And wouldn't you know that all these little fish that have fins and scales happen to be high in omega-3 fatty acids? And not only that, but they live so short, they don't have any mercury. And so, again, I kind of eat this way, not because the Bible said it in Leviticus 11, but it has a lot of principle to it. I don't eat shark much. I mean, if someone talks me into it, I eat shark, fine. But I don't eat it all the time. Because you look at the mercury level of a shark, and it can be like 150. Where if you look at salmon, it's like 0 to 2. I mean, they're so small, they don't eat other things, they eat a lot of plant materials, and they just don't build up toxins. And so isn't that amazing that God knew that we should eat these more primary consumers of fish, and they turn out to have fins and scales, and the ones that are, the carnivores are up there with just kind of skin. And so he could tell his people, by looking on the outside, this is what happens, but didn't have to give them a lecture on being a carnivore.
So what about things like clams and shrimp and oysters?
And so generally they actually are pretty healthy, but they don't have the fins and the scales. And if something's really going to be toxic, it's sitting in the wrong place on the bottom of the wrong place in the Hudson River, and you pick it up. And because they just sit there, they just collect all that toxin. So it's not just mercury, but it can be anything. And so they're kind of like the garbage collectors on the planet. If you get a fish tank at home, you get the right stuff to put in there to clean the stuff off. That's kind of what they do. And generally, I think that they can be really healthy. It's just when you once in a while get a clam that was the wrong place, it turns out to be very toxic. But I eat shrimp. I don't eat it all the time. I eat lobster when you take me out or somebody does and pays for it, then I'll have lobster.
Now, what about land animals? There's dietary laws involving land animals. So how about those?
The same kind of thing. I really was curious about this. So it says you can't eat the ones with paws. Okay, what's bad about a paw? Well, what's bad about a paw is it has claws. And because it has claws, it's catching other things and it's eating other things, and so it's a carnivore. So they don't have to understand all this, but you go, oh my goodness, look at this. Here is a carnivore that's eating other things, and toxins can build up in them. And then you have the animals that are chewing the cud and splitting the hoof. They have this amazing stomach. If they eat things, it ferments, they chew it, they spit it back in there, it goes through. And it's just a completely different kind of animal, and they just eat grass. And so there's always been stories when the first nutritionists you always find out there's the polar bear. Don't eat the polar bear. The liver is toxic, because there was these explorers that went up and started eating the liver, and nobody else does, but they did, and they got sick. Well, that was partly because of toxins. It may have been that there was so much vitamin A built up in this bear that their skin couldn't take it, and they started scaling. So there's reasons for that one too.
Now, what about birds?
Birds are the most fascinating thing is that there's not a single clean bird in the Bible. He doesn't even mention them. He mentions like 24. Don't eat the raven, don't eat the hawk, don't eat the owl, don't eat this. Again, he lists them all and then says nothing. Isn't that interesting? He left it to the Jews to figure it out. And I guess they did okay, because you can eat chicken and those kind of things, but you're not supposed to eat those carnivorous birds. Like if something like, You get a vulture, something could be dead for weeks and it'll find it and it'll just eat it. Well, it just isn't probably very good. It's not good for them, and it's certainly not good for people that eat them, eating all the junk that they just consumed. So yeah, again, that's the fascinating part. God doesn't say a single clean bird, just says don't eat the vulture.
Now, are there food laws that you see in Leviticus 11 that may have no scientific basis for them?
In Leviticus 11, where God put all of the food laws, they all seem to have basis. Now, the Jews would pick up things over here that they would turn into a food law that, to me, doesn't have any basis. And so the one that amazes me is that you cannot have meat and milk together in the same meal. Now, is there some huge law behind that? There's one sentence: you shall not boil a kid in his mother's milk. Okay, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk. Now, that doesn't say you can't have meat and milk together. You can't say you can't boil beef and milk together. You can't. They took that one little scripture and they expanded into this huge thing of 2 kitchens and massive amount of machinery just to eat.
So at the end of the day then, when you look at these dietary restrictions that we see in Scripture, some of them, again, may have importance because of non-scientific factors. But
Right.
What's remarkable is that these dietary laws actually are wonderful guidelines for how we should eat to avoid consuming things that are just not healthy for us.
That's right. And so it's so funny about what God did is things you can tell. Does it have a paw or does it have a cliff? Okay, that's pretty obvious. I can tell the difference between those two. And they didn't know what it was that made them different necessarily. But because of those 2 demarcation things of the paw and the hoof, that they could easily tell these are good for me and these are not. And I just think, what a good God that set up this whole thing with things we can look at morphologically and see things, but there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes.